Probably a few more months.
It's up.
We're good?
Yep, we're good. I can then. All right, I'd like to get the building and grounds meeting started. It's 7:32 or 6:30.
6:32.
6:32. Don't make it later than it is. Go ahead and take roll call.
Mrs. Berger, Mrs. Boyer, Mr. Clausby, Mr. Galzella.
Here.
Mr. Mummert,
Here.
Mr. Plessick,
Here.
Mrs. Weaver, Mrs. Jinxt.
Here.
Mr. Zimmerman. 4 present, 5 absent.
You can discuss it. These can. Yeah, you can.
All right. Is anyone here to, which would like to address the board about something on the agenda this evening?
Rich, before we get into this any further, we had a little bit of a discussion here earlier. Because we don't have a quorum, we cannot vote on any action items on the agenda, okay? We can discuss, but we can't vote on them. So,
I was gonna just skip through, I would skip over items 5 and because those are all ones that we need to take action on and kind of go into the discussion then on the financials.
yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Plessick, if it's all right with you, I could just I wanted to give a quick update on 5A.
Okay.
So one of the things that we had talked about at a previous discussion was about a temporary dean of students at the high school and looking at the data in terms of the discipline and the support for the administrators to be in the classroom. We've decided that the administration would like to create a timeline and create a job description and then submit that to the board for their consideration in September, October, advertise, and then conduct interviews for the position. I know that in the past, there may have been discussion about 1 or 2 of our employees being eligible to serve in that role. But once we do the job description, we'd like to advertise internally and interview our interested candidates and then bring the board a recommendation in October. So even though there's no action tonight and we can't strike this from the agenda, this will not appear in any further agendas until you're presented with a job description for the position, and that would be approved before we would move forward. So just an update on that in case there are any questions.
Okay, thank you.
Dr.
Burkhart?
Can we also, when we do discuss that, can we provide statistics of warrants the position as well?
Yeah.
Work up something that effect.
Absolutely. And what the administration will do is share those statistics and then what we would hope to see happen as a result. Could it be increased presence in the classroom from the administrators? Could it be a reduction in discipline, or could it be a reduction in the number of students who come down a second time? What's the reduction in other behaviors? It's just a whole host of metrics that we want to collaborate and collect on so that when we present it to the board at the end of the year, does it make sense to make it a permanent decision or this position? Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Would there be anything else under that portion of 5A of the agenda that you would like to make known?
The only other thing I would ask, the board has in the past allowed the district administration to employ an employee and then get retroactive approval in order to cover the classes. So again, not asking for any action tonight. I would just inform the board that we will put Kelly Lynch into that position and ask for a retroactive approval. Otherwise, that class is uncovered at the start of school. Again, she's a sub, and our next board meeting is until after the first day of school. So we will put her into that position and then ask for retroactive approval the next day.
And that is something we have done in the past,
Correct.
just because we got to fill the classroom.
That's correct. Yeah, otherwise those students they'll be known in the class.
And we can't have that.
No.
Okay,
Can I have two?
Okay, Rich,
Is
now
that
we
all?
good.
all right. All right, let's move on to agenda item 6A, finance discussion. I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you. We have our finance team here this evening to present some proposals as far as the borrowing for the high school project, the second borrowing for the project, second and or third borrowing. Jay Wanger and Mike Lillis from RBC Capital Markets and Brad Remick and Garrett Moore from PFM are here to present some information. You'll have a packet at your place. And with that, I'll turn it over to them while I get it up on the screen. Yeah, you have to do it through that because we're on live stream. Figure out how to pull this off.
Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. Again, my name's Brad Remig with PFM, and with me is Garrett Moore, Jay Wanger, and Mike Lilly from RBC, as Jeff mentioned. We got together with the administration, with Jeff and with Doug, to talk about funding the high school project now that you have bids and things have been awarded. I know you're working through some things along the way, but generally you're in a spot where you have awarded bids for that project. There are a couple things we wanted to go through with you to talk about different potential options on how to fully fund this, because as was mentioned earlier, last year we did a financing for about 30 million of the project to lock in some interest rates last year. If you recall, right now, as we understand it, the projects are probably in the neighborhood of 70 million or something of that nature. You have 30, and I think you've identified approximately 10 million of cash to be used towards the project. So we still need $30 million to fund the project. A couple things I'll go through just to remind people of some of the different rules, and we wanted to put together 3 scenarios for the committee to have a look at. The first, what you see on the screen now and in front of you is what this is our interest rate chart. It's municipal market data, and it kind of graphs municipal bond interest rates over time. One of the things that you'll notice in the chart that's on the top here, that is kind of interesting, is this looks at what we call as a yield curve. That is an interest rate for each year for the next 30 years. And there's a line there. And what the top chart shows you are the gray bars are in the last 30 years, the high point to the low point. The red line is historic averages, and the blue line is where you are today. Okay, one thing that's interesting about this is you notice the blue line is a little higher than historic averages towards the left, but as you move to the right, it's below for the long-term rates. And what that is largely a function of is what you hear the Federal Reserve doing. They're raising short-term interest rates. So it's impacting what we refer to as the front or the beginning years of a yield curve. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening there. I think what most people don't realize is that if you look at the blue line there again, we're still below historic averages. If you go to the middle chart, Jeff, you'd be kind enough to do that. What we tried to do on this page is graph, we picked the 10-year rate. A lot of you, when people think about the way they measure where interest rates in the corporate or treasury market, they look at the 10-year rate. We similarly look at the 10-year rate in the municipal world. And this shows the 10-year rate for the last 30 years and identifies it. You can see there's a little bit of a legend on the left that has a blue box, a red box, and a green box. And if you look at where we are in the blue box currently, rates have been higher than where they are today for the 10-year, 64% of the time, call it almost 2/3 of the time they've been higher in there. So that would seem to indicate that if you look at history, still better than the average historic to be locking in an interest rate on a bond issue. The bottom chart simply graphs the 10-year rate since January of 2022. That was kind of where we started seeing things coming out of the pandemic, things getting back to a little bit of, different than what we were seeing in 20 and 21. Some talk of inflation that people you've probably been mentioning. We had the war in Ukraine, things of that nature kind of came onto the scene. And then generally speaking, when you look at the 10-year rate, although we're still below historic averages, it did get higher from the levels that we experienced during the pandemic. So that's kind of where we are today. The next page is a list of your payments for your bonds that are currently outstanding. Some of these bonds go down to 2015, 2018 bonds and things of that nature. So if you look at column 2 through column 7, when you add them all up, you come to column 8. That is your total debt service. As we get further along in the discussion, I'll come back to this, but you'll notice that for most of your debt, if you look by fiscal year, the payments are approximately level. Last year, the 22 bond, we had an interest-only payment in the 22-23 budget, and then it started leveling out in the current budget you're in today. And that bond was a fixed-rate bond that goes out to your fiscal year 2049, 2050. The bottom half of the page, that is what we call local effort. That factors in any plan con money that the district would be receiving. Obviously, we know that that's not really available today, but if you look back at your prior issues, I think it's a 2018 A bonds, which was actually a bond that was done 10 years ago. That still gets some plan con reimbursement, and you're still collecting on that. It's just the newer bond issues we haven't been able to get plan con on. The other thing too, as you look at the bottom, Jeff, you you'll notice on that line, we have what we call a call date. That is when the bonds can be refinanced or prepaid or refinanced or paid off without penalty. We have reached a point getting towards that for your 18 and 18A bonds. We have looked at it and we really didn't see any savings to refinance at this point in time. But that's something that we want you to know that we're keeping an eye on. And there's some other bonds that are coming up that are callable as we get in the future. And it'll be our responsibility to get in touch with the district if we can refinance and save any money. So that's where we are as of today. So a couple things that we wanted to kind of review with everybody was about doing a tax exempt financing for a bond for a project. There's certain rules and certain things we need to make sure we follow, because you get the benefit of issuing bonds at a lower tax exempt rate. I kind of covered the market update on the top, but I just wanted to kind of review under the heading capital project planning. I think I touched about this already a little bit, is that right now we understand that the high school project has been bid and awarded. There's about 70 million. We did, as I mentioned earlier, 30 million last year. We have about 10 million of cash, and so we need another 30 million or so to fully fund the project. And one of the things that we know when we talked about as a team that was important is we wanted to make sure that we borrow the right amount of money. We don't want to over borrow. We don't want to under borrow. We want to make sure that we kind of track the project and borrow the appropriate amount of money to pay for the project costs. And that's kind of something that's going to evolve and has been evolving over time. Now that we're a step closer with the bids in. I did a recap of the 22. Again, we did about 30 million last fall, and the average borrowing rate was just under or just above 4%, 4.19. And then the final maturity, as I mentioned before, pays off in your 49-50 fiscal year. So, okay, so now as it applies to federal tax laws, one of the things that we wanted to remind you was that when you borrow money on a tax-free basis, you have to have reasonable expectations, and you're going to spend that within 3 years, or 85% of the proceeds within 3 years. So you can't go ahead and borrow money on a tax-free basis for a project that may occur in 10 years from now, for example. You kind of have to keep that in mind when you do the borrowing and so forth. And we have to proceed with due diligence, and we also need to make sure in the time test that there's a design contract or a construction bid within like 6 months or so is what the rule is. And it seems like we've met those tests here at Southwestern to be able to consider some more financing for the high school project. As we go to the next page, there are a couple other things that I thought would be important to mention. I think we've mentioned some of these things in the past, but there's another thing that I want to go over that's been kind of a more newer development since the last time you financed the project. First is, if you remember, we talked a little bit about having bank qualified bonds. If your bonds are bank qualified, or loans, quite frankly, that means normally what we see is a little bit of an interest rate advantage to the borrower, and we normally see a little bit more advantageous prepayment provisions. That call date's a little earlier. You noticed maybe when I went over the 2018 bonds that you did had a call date in 5 years. That's because they were done bank qualified, and that's generally what the market will accept. Okay. Now we did want to make notice that usually we see a nice interest rate advantage. I'll call it 0.25%, just maybe a historic average. Right now, we're not seeing as much of a benefit from bank qualified. I think as I could turn it over to Mike and Jay, but I think we just see fewer bank buyers that are out there. The banks aren't buying as many of these bonds right now, I think because of a lot of other things they're dealing with. So that advantage from an interest rate perspective has not been as great, if at all, as versus when maybe in the last 3 to 5 years from now. And even last year was a little bit of benefit, but that the market today just does not seem to be as much in favor of that. Okay. Arbitrage rebate considerations. Now, this is something that's a little bit new, and it kind of goes back to the fact that we, as I showed you that very first interest rate chart, where the rates on the left in the earlier years were higher than averages, but the rates on the right were below the historic averages. Again, that's largely because of what's going on with the Federal Reserve. So this rule has always been there. I shouldn't say it's new, but it's not something we've really had to talk about very much. And that is arbitrage. And what that means is technically under the rules, you can't borrow money at a certain rate and earn more than that and keep it because you already have the benefit of the tax exempt rates. Okay. However, there is what we call a small issuer exemption. And that is if you borrow, remember for bank qualified, I said 10 million or less in a calendar year. For small issuer, it's 15 million or less in a calendar year, not a school year, a calendar year. And what that says is if you meet all the different rules, all these tests, obviously we would be in touch with your bond counsel and so forth. But if you borrow less than 15 million during the 3 years during the construction period, that temporary period's available, you may be able to retain all the money you've earned and not have to return any arbitrage benefits. Okay, that's again meeting all the rules, things of that nature. But it's what we call the small issuer exemption. We've always talked about the 10 million BQ. We haven't had an environment like this right today, like we see today, where you're actually, if you borrow money, you're likely to be able to lock an interest rate, long-term rate that's lower than what Jeff and Doug can get on the investments right now. So it's just something we thought you should know about because it's kind of something new. If you're over 15 million, there's still some time-based and spending exceptions that you could meet if you met one of these 3 that's mentioned up above. And one's called a construction exception, one's called an expenditure exception. But for example, if on the last one, the most common one, 24-month spending exception would say that if you borrow the money, even if you're over 15 million, and you spend it expeditiously, I'll call it, so 10% of it within 6 months, 45% within 12 months, and all of it within 24, then even if you're over 15 million, you may be able to keep those arbitrage benefit dollars, all the money that you've earned in that construction period during that period of time. One thing about the spending exceptions is that if you miss one, it's over. You got to meet them all. Okay, so those are just some things we haven't really had to spend too much talking about in the past, just because we haven't experienced an environment where you're actually able to earn some interest on your money during the construction period. So those are some things going into the numbers that I thought we should mention, and I'll turn it over to my partners to see if I missed anything. I'm good. Good? Okay.
The first bond issue we did last year may hit that arbitrage, but the first bond issue we did last year, we may have to pay some of that arbitrage back.
Right. And I think that one of the nice things that Jeff's done is that he's making sure it's tracked. You want to make sure you track that. And so, for example, we still would want to make sure you track all this. And there's some programs out there that are available that have that as part of their investment program. So that's good.
Jeff, that arbitrage you mentioned we're paying back, is that based off of we're hitting a timeline barrier or?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to meet the spending thresholds that you see listed on that chart.
The
And
6
so,
month or the 18-month?
well, I'd have to check, but I don't know that we're going to spend, we borrowed the money in October. We're not going to have 45% of it spent within 12 months.
Right.
Just because of where we're at with the project. So I know we're going to miss that. So what we're looking at is we're going to create a separate interest-bearing account. Well, not an interest-bearing account. We're going to put the interest into a separate account. So we'll keep track of it that way. And then when it comes to arbitrage, whatever we earn above the 4.19%, we have to share that back to the federal government.
But we're experiencing a loss if we go out to the 24-month, then I assume what
Well, no,
ballpark,
as Brad just said, once we miss any of those,
then
it's
we
off.
lose
We
it.
can't keep all that arbitrage.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
So,
So what are we facing losing
well,
money-wise?
whatever we earn above 4.19%, we don't know what that amount is yet. we're earning about $100,000 a month right now. I don't know what that number is going to be, and we won't know that till that $30 million is spent.
Okay.
Remember, it's not, and the one thing I always like to caution folks in thinking of what are you losing is you're able to keep what you borrowed at. So
Sure.
that's not bad. They just don't want you to keep more than that. And that's kind of the way the IRS is.
They don't
Because
want
they're
us-
giving,
They don't want us profiting from it.
right, yeah. Right. Yeah, and we'll be working to get a draw schedule too. One of the things that we want to do from the construction manager is kind of get an idea of how that might work. So we can keep track of all that as well. To maybe figure out approximately when you're going to spend in, what does this all mean? So we give an idea to say to Jeff and Doug, oh, you might earn a certain amount of arbitrage here. So we want to make sure we track it. Because the one thing that I don't want my clients to do is borrow the money, invest it, earn all this interest, spend it all, and then have somebody say, oh, guess what? You made $1 million of arbitrage that you need to pay back. That would not be a fun thing. So that's why we very strongly encourage people to keep an eye on this. So if we get up to ourselves to a point that we make any, that we have the money set aside, we've only spent us to what we're allowed to keep.
The good news here is that you get to keep the earnings that are equal to or less than from a interest. You get to keep all the earnings up until the interest rate on your bond.
Just so
You
we're
have to-
live streaming, so
you have to speak on
everybody
the
in
mic.
audience, live stream, could you step up to the mic and just, go ahead.
Just repeat it so they know.
We want
No, I was just
everybody
gonna,
if I can watch
yeah, sorry.
hear you.
Hi, everybody. No, the point I was trying to make is that you're at least able to keep the earnings up until the rate on your bonds, say if the rate were 4%. I mean, a few years ago, and for many years before that, you were only earning like maybe 0.5% or something. So the good news is you're gonna still be able to keep a lot of interest earnings. It's just the excess over the bond rate.
Right, and that's why I was asking the time constraint, because we're losing our earnings if we don't hit our time constraint.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to identify what the timeline is and what the monies are involved.
Well, we borrowed the first, we borrowed the first group of funds last October. I believe it was October we settled. And so you see, we had to have 10% of that spent within 6 months. We probably met that because at 30 million, we had to spend about 3 million, and architect fees are going to be close to that, plus other fees that we would have incurred. That would have been close, but definitely 45% by October. We haven't, officially broken ground or anything at this point in time. Once we do that, we start to see cost of $2 million a month, $3 million a month. That adds up pretty fast, but we haven't been there yet. So my guess is we're not going to hit that. So in my mindset, when we're looking at the arbitrage issue with regard to that 22 bond issue, we're segregating those interest earnings, holding them aside so that we can make that refund payment, if you will, to the federal government, so that they share in that once we identify what that cost is, because, we know we're not going to be able to qualify and keep all that. We probably, moving forward, will be able to hit those timeframes because we're going to be in construction at that point in time. But, for the first one, I don't know that we will. Again, the catch-22 is we went out and borrowed that money early to try to get it before the interest rates. And as Brad said, and as Michael said, we're earning 4.9%. We weren't earning that. We weren't getting the last couple construction projects we had, we weren't getting any interest. And to get about $100,000 a month interest is good. To be able to keep 80% of that, or whatever that number might end up being, that's going to help, because that defers the total cost of the project.
Right.
So, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, I don't necessarily personally like to share the federal government, but anyway, we have to follow the rules.
Right, I get that. I just wanted to make sure, because if we have to pay that back, then we're hitting our taxpayers for any,
No, not even the
No.
taxpayers, because it's interest that we've earned. It's only the interests
that would have been applied towards capital projects.
that would have been going towards this project.
Right.
It's not impacting taxpayers because it's up to the level that we have.
But if we earned that money and applied it towards this project, then we're then in turn not having to fill that amount of money in from our tax base.
For any of the money that's above the 4.19%, whatever that may be. Now, one of the things we could have done, which we didn't do, we could have locked in our interest at 4.19%. So we're just going to
Mhm.
get the same amount of money as we're paying out. We don't do that. We usually try to get as much as we can. So
Because it's cumulative. Okay, because if sometimes Jeff and Doug are at 2, then they go to 5, and then the Fed starts lowering rates in the fall,
right.
then it goes to 3.
No, I
So, yeah,
understand
you
that
wanna
part of
do
it.
what Jeff's
Yeah,
doing.
as far as
Yeah.
the making the money, and the Fed's gonna keep raising rates
Could be.
so long as they don't bankrupt the banks that have all those bonds that are now worthless.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so, all right, so those were some of the things I wanted to highlight in terms of some of the rules and that newer one, or something that's come into play. I shouldn't say newer. It's more in play than it hasn't been in the past. So we worked with the RBC team and the PFM team to come up with a couple different scenarios to illustrate for you as to how you may proceed with financing. There, one column is in blue, there's another column in yellow, and there's another column in green. What the blue column contemplates is the district this fall locking in $30 million, what we anticipate to be the balance needed for the project. Because remember, 70 minus 30 already, minus the 10 of cash. Okay, so that's where we get to the 30. Do that. And we kind of put in the box up above that you see on the screen some of the things as to remind you. For example, we're assuming settlement this fall. We are not having any payments in this budget year, 23, 24. Okay, that wouldn't occur till 24, 25. In the blue, because it's 30 million, it's non-BQ, non-bank qualified. Remember, that was the 10 million thing, so that would not be non-bank qualified. Small issuer exemption would not apply, okay, because we're over 15 million. Now, I didn't put anything in there about spending exceptions because we want to make sure, as Jay mentioned, having a draw schedule to be able to tell you whether we think you may or may not apply for that. So we were silent on that, but in the blue, you would be eligible to meet the spending exceptions that we mentioned earlier if you proceed expeditiously with those types of things. Okay, that would be something you would eligible. Can't determine that right now. The structure here is level debt service, much like your other debt. We basically have the same payment every year, and we ran the numbers out to the same final maturity that we did for last year's bond issue. That's 4950, okay? And that term is 26 years. So if you were to look at column 7, that's all the stuff you already have, including the 22 bond issue, okay? Column 8 would be the payment, we estimate, principal and interest, okay, through 2050 for $30 million. Column 7 plus column 8 gives you column 9. Okay, so you see where the current budget in total for all your debt is, and you'd see where it has to go to next year. Okay, so it goes from 4.4 to 6.3, I'll call it, and change. A couple things that I'll make a note of because it'll be important later, and you don't have to memorize these numbers. But if you look at the bottom of column 9, you'll notice the existing debt plus this new 30 million, what the total payment would be on all your existing debt and your new debt and this new 30 million. It does not factor in or consider any refinancings you do in the future. Okay, because if there's something you can refinance and lower that, we would likely do that. But that's kind of where you are, and you look at the bottom of column 9. The second scenario in the yellow we modeled up, it says, let's do $15 million this fall, and then $15 million as you get onto the project, you know, maybe next spring or summer or later in 2024. And we mentioned that to show you what it would mean if you split them up. Now, if you look at column, the box up top, excuse me, you'll notice both those steps are still non-bank qualified. Again, they're over 10 million, so they're non-bank qualified. You would be eligible for the small issuer exemption. We need to figure out what that means, and that's still a to be determined just because it depends on how quickly you spend the money and what the borrowing rate is versus what the investment rate is, but you would be eligible if you spend it within 3 years. If you look at that would give you a total of $30 million. Now, if you were to go to column 12 at the bottom, you'll notice, okay, column 7 is your existing, payments on the 10s, payments on the 11s, and column 11, excuse me, and that totals at the bottom in 2050, the total payments. You'll notice that it's slightly lower total dollars over life because you're borrowing $15 million later than you're not borrowing all 30. You're borrowing 15 and then 15, you know, 8 months later, 7 months later. So you don't have to pay interest on it. The big assumption is, we have to make a little bit more of a educated guess as to where interest rates are going to be in June of 2024. We don't know where they're going to be. We have a better idea of where they might be in November of 23 because it's a little bit closer, although none of us know for sure. So that's kind of what we did there. Again, level payments, you'll notice. Oh, the other thing I should point out is if you notice in the 24-25 budget, if you look at column 12 and you compare it to that same year in column 9, you'll notice that the payments is a little bit less in next budget year. Again, you're not paying interest on everything. You're paying interest on a little bit less. So it gives you a little bit more time to step it in. Okay? Now, the green option is another option we wanted to model for the district, and that is we made the assumption that in November this year, you borrow 20 million, and then next year in June of 2024, you borrow 10 million. And the reason we want to demonstrate that, although it's not labeled correctly up here, you would, the middle, the step 2 would be BQ. So please scratch out the non. It would be eligible to be bank qualified. The one on the left, step 1, the 20 million would not still be non-bank qualified. It would also be not eligible for small issuer. But again, step 2 would be BQ and it would be eligible for small issuer exemption. Okay. So then if you go here, I'll move you right over to column 15 at the total at the bottom. You'll notice that that is right in between the two because you haven't borrowed all 30 million up front, but you've borrowed a little bit more up front and less on the back end. And again, you can see there's a little bit less of an impact in next year's budget, 24-25, but there's a little, it's kind of in the middle of those two. So with that, there's a lot of numbers going on here. I should probably pause for questions.
Yes, I've got one. So, if we delay the 15 million in options 2 or 3, we're risking a hike in interest rate, which I consider likely. So in option 3, the BQ, what percentage of savings does that typically give us compared to a percentage of interest rate hike?
Right. So I would tell you in history, if for example, we did the green and we did the 20 million, I would say, let's just hypothetically said, if you could get a 4.25, much like you did on your last one, if you did a bank qualified, historically, you'd probably be able to get more like a 4. Right now, that difference is not there. So I can't tell you what would happen in June of 2024 if the bank qualified benefit would be there, but it's not there right now.
Okay, so basically there is no advantage to waiting for BQ considering we could see a tax increase. I mean, not a tax, interest rate increase.
Yeah, and I think the markets are pretty good at pricing these things in. I forget what I read today. And again, remember the Fed is playing with short-term rates, not the long-term rates. These are 26-year bonds, as you know, so it's a long-term financing. So but I will say, I would agree with the comment that in June of 2024, it's a lot more unlikely to know where rates are going to be. They could be lower. They could be lower. Could be higher. I don't know. I don't get paid enough to make that call and tell my clients that they're going to be higher or lower. But that's one thing that you would have to consider if you did yellow or you did green. Where is that second column going to be in the future? Could be higher, could be lower. I don't know, but there's a little bit more time to uncertainty of where that might be. Right. Oh yeah, good point. So as I mentioned earlier, on the bank qualified, you get normally a little bit more of advantage on the prepayment or call date. That's usually 5 years. Whereas if we do any non-BQ, it's probably going to be, it's anywhere from 7 to 10 years. We're seeing 8 years now. But that just means if you did the BQ, you would have a sooner option to refinance tax exempt under the current laws. I always kind of want to say that too, because what goes on in Washington, you never really going to know. But typically, you would get the benefit of the shorter call feature if you did BQ. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to do here, and then I'm going to pause, is we also wanted to show you another concept that is permitted under state law, and that is not making your payments level on this bond issue, but structuring the bond issue to have overall level debt service. Because under state law, you have to have level or declining debt service. So what you could do, if you wanted to, is, and I probably should have pointed this out before we turn the page. Maybe we can go back, Jeff, if you don't mind. And what I'm going to try and do here is, I'm just because it's easiest in the blue here, you'll notice in column 9, as Jeff scrolls down, that there's different points in time where your debt service drops by keeping it level. If you'll notice, in 10 years from now, the debt payments drop. In, what's that, about 15 years from now, they drop again. Okay? Because other debt gets paid off. So what you would be naturally building into your debt service in your budget is different debt drop-offs for which the board could take advantage of for if they had any new projects coming at those points in time, if that makes sense. Okay. So with the wraparound, what we're doing is we are taking advantage of that now. And we do that to take advantage of it now so as to get your total debt service in your budget when you come, lower than what if you had just done level debt. And I'll go back to you and hopefully show this to you in a second. But you'll notice, okay, in the blue, don't have to go through as much. You'll notice that in column 8, the payments are a little bit lighter up front. And then as some of your other debt gets paid off, I'll call it in 2039, 24, the payment goes up. And that's what we call a wraparound. Okay, so what you do is have less principal paid off up front. You put more principal at the back end when your other debt gets paid off, and you try and have, you take advantage more of that debt drop off today. And in return, what you get is by the time you get to your 25-26 budget, you'll notice your total debt payments, other debt plus this one, is lower than the prior page. So for example, in 2026, your total debt in the blue is a little over 5.7 million. If you go back to the prior page, it was 6,350,000. Okay? But you don't see as dramatic debt drops as you go into the future. So that's what's called a wraparound structure. The one other thing we should probably point out, and I'm just going to go to blue here because you can see that the same concepts apply for the yellow and the green on this. But if you look for the blue, you look at the total at the bottom. If you look at the bottom of 9, you'll notice the total payments for all your debt plus this new debt is about just under $150 million. 149.6 or so is what's shown here. If you were to go to the prior page, I think I mentioned this before, the number is about 141.8. So you'll have more total dollars over the life of the bond issue that you'll have to pay in interest. Obviously, if you refinance, you might be able to recapture or close that gap. But because you're not paying as much principal down up front, it's kind of like doing an interest-only construction loan if you're building a home or something, then you would see a little more total dollars over the life. And that's in exchange for having less impact to your budget up front by doing the level payment structure. So we wanted to at least show that to the group so you could see what you're allowed to do and what you may want to do or may not want to do. I did put a bunch of things on the next couple pages and bullet points. Do you want me to pause there, Jeff? Do you want to talk? Or you want to keep going? Okay. All right. So we kind of tried to put for you some of the different things that we could see as potential advantages or considerations for each of the options. One of the advantages that was pointed out earlier is that the interest rates are locked in now for the planned financing. That is, you don't have to worry about what's going to happen in June of 2024. You lock it in now. You know what your interest rate is, and so forth. It provides the lowest issuance costs because you're doing one single financing, not two financings. The one thing I do want to point out and pause here for is it's not dollar for dollar because many of the fees are related to the size of the issue. But there are some costs we have to pay, some different legal document costs. We get paid for two transactions, paying agents, things of that nature. So there are costs, but it's not dollar for dollar. Okay, most of them are related to the size of the issue, but we wanted to point out that it is a little bit lower by doing a single financing. We mentioned potentially higher interest earnings. I mentioned before, if you borrow more money, you pay more interest on it. And let's kind of put arbitrage aside for the moment, but if you get more money in the bank up front, you're going to earn more interest. Just be a matter of whether we meet the spending exceptions. We can't be for sure certain whether, as we get into option 2, whether you had 215 millions that qualify for small issuer, whether you'll actually be able to earn and retain more earnings than option 1. But we did want to say that there's potentially higher interest earnings because you're getting the money sooner. Considerations, as I mentioned before, the bond issue would be non-bank qualified. You would not qualify for small issuer, and you have the higher debt service payment in your 24-25 budget. Number 2, that was the gold, that was the yellow, columns. That's the 15 million. I think I mentioned to you before already that both series of bonds would be eligible for small issuer exception. And you would have the ability to take a little bit longer time to phase the payment into your budget. And it may buy you a little bit more time, as you kind of start to break ground and you're 6 to 12 months into the project, learning more about how much money you really need, how much interest earnings are you going to make, and things of that nature. It gives you a little bit more time to say, okay, maybe we don't need all 15 million, maybe we need 14 and a half. I don't know, but it gives you a little bit more time. The considerations, as I mentioned, bonds will be non-bank qualified, higher issuance costs because there's 2 financings, and you're subject to future market conditions for the second financing. Option 3, the advantages of one of the bond issues would be bank qualified. The bank qualified series of bonds would be eligible for small issuer, as I mentioned before, ability to phase in the new debt service into the next year, into the budget over a 2 or 3 year period, and the ability to refine the last borrowing with the costs of the project. The considerations, one of the bond borrowings would be non-bank qualified. The non-bond qualified series of bonds would not be qualified for the small issuer. There would be higher cost of issuance, much like in option 2, and you would be subject to future market conditions. Those are I think I kind of talked through those along the way, but I wanted you to have them, in a bullet point form. So when you go back and look at this again, you kind of remember what I mentioned. So with that, sorry for taking so long, but there's a lot that
No, I
goes on in
appreciate
this.
Very thorough, thank you.
Can I just ask one more question?
Mhm.
Can you go over again what you get out of a small issuer acceptance
Okay.
exactly?
So if you qualify for a small issuer exemption, there's a 3-year period of time where when you invest your money, you can retain all the earnings.
Okay.
Okay. The 2022 bond, we don't have that. Okay. Because that would be, it was over 15 million. So you'll be able to retain it. Obviously, we don't know where interest rates are going to go over the next couple months. We just don't, or next couple of years, really, to be quite frank with you. So I can't tell you that you would make an arbitrage positive there. You may not, because it's a
Mhm.
cumulative thing, but you would be able to be comfortable retaining the earnings if you
Thank
can meet all the
That
rules.
clarifies it.
Yep.
So it's correct that you could get the small issuer exception, which means we would get to keep all of the earnings versus the time-based spending exception, which is where the arbitrage come in. If we're under the 15 million, we get to keep it all.
You don't have to make spending exceptions.
Perfect.
Did I get that right? For 3 years, yes.
And yeah, it'll be done in 3 years. That's
And
fine.
then the calendar year is defined by
I know, it's
January
3
1 to
years.
December 31st, regardless of, it's not a calendar year from when you buy it or borrow it. It's calendar year from January 1 to January 31st.
That's correct. And it's not always not a school year, it's a calendar year.
Got it. Thank you.
So I just wanted to also provide some information regarding cost to the district. And so, and then we'll let you ask all kinds of questions because based upon this information may generate even more questions for you. But when we got the information from the finance team as to estimated cost for these bonds for the various options, I went ahead and costed it out compared to what our millage is in place for borrowings and what our mills bring in for each of our from our taxpayers. And so you can see there are 7 pages there. The pages correspond to the options that were presented. The first 4 pages are all level debt. I have 2 different options for option 2. Because from my perspective, when I look at this, and I'll just share my thoughts on it, I think that we'd have potentially challenges meeting the time-based spending exception if we borrowed $30 million this year. I just don't know how you make some of those timeframes when we're still have the majority of $40 million ready to go. So from that perspective, I kind of ruled that one out. The second page is the And so when looked at these, I looked at both level debt and wraparound debt. Wraparound debt, as Brad indicated, is more expensive over the life of the borrowing, but it's less expensive up front. You don't need to have as much millage in place for it because you're pushing the payments out later in the term. And so you're paying more interest on that money longer, but it's more affordable per se. So I went and looked at the level debt scenarios, all the level debt scenarios, in order to have a zero being covering the tax rates covering the cost for our debt. We're looking at having to go up to between 2.84 and 2.90 mils. Right now, we're at 2.54 mils dedicated debt service. And we're on our path to go up to 2.74 mils, which was approved by board resolution back in February of 2021. So that's where my base was starting from. And you can see on page 1 that the 2.9 mils get you up to cover the costs. But what it doesn't do for you, every one of those yellow lines going across is when we'd anticipate doing the next building project. Park Hills would be next in 27, 28. 31, 32 would be West Manheim. Manheim would be 35, 36. Again, every 20 to 24 years, we're refreshing our buildings and upgrading them to whatever is the up-to-date codes, and also, HVAC and mechanical systems. So while that's not necessarily an issue right now, we're talking about the high school, it does come into play for future borrowings and for future projects. And that's something I think that we need to talk about as we go through the budget process, because again, do we want to, once we get up to 2.74 mils, want to continue to keep going up to pay for future projects? Where's that going to end? Where's it going to stop at? And all that's something I need to do a lot more studying on and try and do some projections out that I don't have involved in this. All this is looking at what it would take for the high school project in the current borrowings. As they indicated, Brad indicated, what we have currently is all level debt. I've always recommended level debt. The reason for that is it's less expensive. I always look for the lowest cost to taxpayers. And it also gives us the flexibility of giving us borrowing capacity for future projects. So usually you have some debt rolling off, and then it gives you capacity to borrow more money to do the next projects. That's why for years and years and years, we didn't have to have any tax increases to fund our projects. We were always able to do them just because you had debt falling off in order to borrow more money. And what you're going to see, what I saw when I did all these numbers and looked at all the numbers, is that level debt saves the district on option 2, which is option 2 is the lowest cost option in either the wraparound or the level debt. The lowest cost option is option 2. Option 2, between level debt versus wraparound debt, level debt is about $7.5 million cheaper over the life of the borrowing than wraparound debt. So again, if we're looking at long-term, what's in the best interest of taxpayers, in my opinion, in my recommendation, I'm looking at level debt. It's better for us from a borrowing capacity standpoint moving forward. It's better for the taxpayers long-term in total cost. Now, what I did do after I did both those scenarios, and again, the wraparound debt, the benefit of the wraparound debt, when you get up to 2.74 mils, it covers the cost. So at 2.74 mils, you can do wraparound debt. You wouldn't have to go up higher than 2.74 mils, and it covers everything in the high school project. So what I did on page 3, I have the number in the bottom right-hand corner, is I said, well, what happens if we stop at 2.74 mils with the level debt with the 2 borrowings? I think the 2 borrowings gives us the small issuer exception, which means we could keep the interest we earn. We don't know about interest rate risk. That could be higher next year. I understand that. But again, trying to do a calculation now to project that, you can't really do. But what I can do is if I'm able to keep 100%, I can do that math. It's 100%. What I did was I stopped it at 2.74 mils and said, what if we stop at 2.74 mils? Can we still afford the high school project? And the answer is you can. However, you're going to have a couple of years, 5 or 6 years, where you're going to be eating into fund balance to help do that. We are increasing our assessed values each year, so you're getting a little bit of an increase regarding the increase in assessments. And each 10th of a mil brings in about $215,000, at least right now. So you can see what would happen, in 25, 26, it would take a potential $508,000 hit approximately. Again, these numbers are going to change because we'll have assessed values that'll be different at that point. And then the following year, we'd take a hit of about $447,000, $387,000 the following year, $321,000, $257,000. You see how that goes down. When you add up all those negatives, the negatives are $2.1 million. And again, keep in mind, you're going to be saving $7.5 million over the life of the borrowing by going level debt versus wraparound debt. So I think there should be some thought given to structuring it with the option 2 level debt borrowings. And then again, the issue becomes if the board's comfortable with eating into some of the fund balance to keep the funding for the borrowing at 2.74 mils, or whether we want to move higher than 2.74 mils. And again, we don't even hit 2.74 mils till 25, 26. So that's certainly not a decision the board has to make at this point in time. We can make that as part of the regular normal budget process as we discuss the entire financial picture of the district. So I think that's what I have at this point, and we'll open up the questions for everybody. Anybody has questions?
So you mentioned going into fund balance. So we typically keep our fund balance at what?
We try to keep our fund balance at 8%, which is what we're maxed out at by law. And if you recall the last 2 years in the budget process, because our fund balance has exceeded that amount, we haven't been able to increase property taxes up to the Act 1 index. So we feel, in talking with Doug, that we have the capacity to be able to absorb those hits for a couple years without significant impact to the fund balance. Each year, we're usually, if we have a good operating year, we usually are increasing our fund balance, right? We're conservative on our revenue estimates, so they usually come in better than expected. We're conservative on our expenditure estimates, they usually come in better than expected. Usually in a good year, we're actually adding to fund balance anyway. So if we're adding to fund balance because of operations, and we're subtracting from fund balance because of debt service, I think that that's going to work out.
Jeff, that assumes level state funding as well, correct?
Yes, yeah, we're not factoring in any Plan Con monies because at this point in time, there are no funds coming in. Now, that could change too. 5 years from now, the state could start funding Plan Con again. 3 years from now, they could, which would make us reevaluate this whole thing. Keep in mind, we used to receive between 25% and 35% in reimbursement from the state for our construction projects. That was nice. I mean, a project of this size, you look at, 30%, which is in the middle of the two, that's $17.5 million that would be reimbursed from the state to help our taxpayers forego this project or forego the cost of this project. That was the way it was until 2012, 13. Then they put a moratorium in and they just stopped funding construction projects. There is money in the budget this year, not much, 125 million. They're starting to put some money in. These is the money I understand this year is more for renovation and not renovation, small projects. If you want to put a roof on a building, if you want to do a chiller, or you want to do air handling units or something like that, small stuff, $100,000, maybe $200,000 or less. So it's not a lot of money. But our hope is, and our advocacy at the state level is to try to get the General Assembly to keep increasing that funding so that they start to fund some of these construction projects like they had in the past. If that happens, that changes the dynamics because then we won't need as much tax increases to help pay for future projects like I'm anticipating that we're going to need now, because right now there is nothing. I can't count on something we don't have yet. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's what you're looking for.
I have one more question to highlight this. So if, to my mind, if the federal interest rate goes up and we do a second borrowing, not only we win twice because, again, we can borrow early, the interest rate goes up, we then get the small issuer, we get to keep that money. To my opinion, I think it's very likely interest rates are going to go up in the next year, which will cover the two borrowings versus the one. So just from the get-go, I think two borrowings makes way more sense than a single borrowing for that reason.
Plus, it's cheaper. I mean, when you look at all three of them across, it's the lowest cost.
7.5 million as well,
In the
right?
long
So,
run, right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I tend to look at the bottom line, give me what the cheapest option is, and
right.
it makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you guys have any recommendations along those lines. I mean, you guys are the experts, but we've had these conversations before. You have to go to the mic. Sorry.
Sorry.
No one else can hear you if you don't.
Hi, everybody. No, there are advantages to both. I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages to all of them. All right. So, I mean, as an advisor, looking at the two-step, the lowest cost to the client, although we don't know what column 2 is going to be yet. I got to
Right.
caveat that. Taking advantage of what we're given in terms of different tax law things, I like to see my clients be able to take advantage of. The other thing that I think is important too is even if rates are higher in 6 months, and for the second financing, remember, you've always done a very good job of refinancing, right? So at some point over the life of these 26-year bonds, I would think that the district would have an option to refinance and recapture some of those things of that nature. Once you've spent all the money for construction and you've had the earnings, that option's not there anymore. So any interest that you would earn on the money to help offset the costs and some of the other things you want to do, is gone. But refinancing is something that this group of people will always be watching for the school district, to make sure we don't miss an opportunity. If in fact, second column, rates are higher, well, we got to keep the interest earnings, but we'll recover for refinancing, I would think, in the future.
And I'll add to that, the reason why we're looking at $70 million as far as the total cost, even though we're looking at potentially $75 million when we started talking about it, is we're expecting to get some savings from value engineering. We're also expecting to earn some interest earnings from these bonds that we had not really projected or put into that whole pot. So if we make $2 million in interest, that's going to help. If we get value engineering savings of, 1.5, 2 million, or whatever that number might be, that's why we're looking at 70 million. Again, we don't want to overborrow. In talking with Doug, when we get to the end of the project, if it's 71 million and we only borrowed 70, we have options. We can take $1 million out of fund balance. We can take it out of potentially capital reserve funds if we need to. We can go to the local bank and get a $1 million loan. We have options so we don't overborrow money, because we don't want to borrow an extra $2 million or whatever and have to pay it over 26 years. With the call provisions, we're stuck with that for at least 5 to 10 years. So I don't want to overborrow. We don't want to do that. So I think that it's a prudent way to do it. It's a prudent approach. We think that come the end of the project, when we actually have good numbers as to what it is, we'll have a real good handle on how to deal with that. So I think that's also helpful. Thanks, Brian. So questions? You got the pros here.
Are you going to be putting anything on the agenda then for the upcoming meeting for this?
That's up to the committee. If you direct us to put something on the agenda, we can certainly do that. That's up to you folks. There is a process. When we get the go-ahead, we have to advertise it. So I'd have to contact bond counsel. They have to put an advertisement in the paper that we're looking to take action on this. We adopt a resolution that says that we're going to go through this process. We have to get documents together. We have to do rating agency calls. I have to get a whole, well, Doug has to get a whole bunch of documents together. Not me. Doug gets a whole bunch of stuff together that we send to the rating agencies, which essentially are financial reports. He's in the process of doing them now. He has to, expedite the process and try to get that stuff as much as we can to the rating agencies. We go through the process. RBC sells the bonds. So it's not something that happens if we get board approval August 23rd. It doesn't happen August 24th. That's why last year, if you recall, we got approval in August and they didn't sell till October 10th, I want to say, something like that, middle of October. So it takes time. I know rating agency call was in early September last year. So to answer your question, if it's the direction of the committee to place something on the agenda, you have several options. One of the things I thought was helpful too, I like providing the board with options. Options are better than just one, here's what we want to do. So which option do you like? And if you wish us to put something on the agenda for consideration, we can certainly do that.
Well,
At this point in time, I've done all the talking, so I, anybody there? Well, besides Brad.
at this point, from my viewpoint, option 2, level debt service, doing 15 and 15, to me, is the most economical for our taxpayers, and it gives us a benefit of, I won't say recouping, but generating some income that we can put towards the project, not that it doesn't affect our taxpayers in the future, because we're getting some money in, which If we didn't get that money in, there's a possibility we'd have to go for more. So that would cost more to the taxpayers. So we're not going to be doing that part. So it's more beneficial to the taxpayer, more beneficial to us because it's not as much cost over the life of the loans or bonds. So in my opinion, option 2, level debt, which is 15 and 15 over the next 2 years.
And are you looking at option 1 or B? Option 1 would be trying to get up to 2.9 mils to cover the cost, or B, which is 2.74 mils, which would take us a little bit out of fund balance versus, having it covered.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry to throw that other
No,
option in
no,
there,
no,
but
you're right, because that is a part of what, of the direction. And my suggestion would be option 2B. Because we already have the ability to go up to 2.74 over the next 2 years. And in the next 2 years, when we're doing budget calculations, every year, we're gonna have that option then again to alter the amount of tax base money to go to projects, which will be coming down the line.
Well, B just levels it at the 2.7 mils, correct?
right. All
The
B does,
option-
yeah,
the
all B.
First option keeps it going up.
Mhm.
Well,
or keep
yeah,
the
the first
mills
option
going.
shows that you'd have to go up a little higher than 2.74 in order to fully fund that option.
Right.
Now, is it 2.84 or 2.9? Again, what I've done is I have an assumption in there that our assessed values are increasing at 1%. They've historically increased higher than 1%. So you might be able to get away with 2.84, 2.85. I don't know. We don't know exactly what that is, but it gives you an idea, gives you a ballpark.
I'm comfortable. I'm definitely for the level as far as that's concerned, and the splitting it up seems to give us the lowest risk and the best opportunity, not knowing what the future, not having a crystal ball or something. But I'm before, I mean, whether it was B or A or B here on that, I'm for trying to keep up with the debts, you know what I mean? I'd be for that program rather than even knowing that we have it, just not knowing, but that's a decision that can be made down the road.
Correct. There's made 2 years from now when we are doing budgets, or even next year.
And I'm going to concur as well. I think 2B, not only, like Rich mentions, it locks, it doesn't go higher than 2.74, which a lot of the other options do. It gives us that ability. The 2 borrowings allows us to potentially make earnings we can keep and apply to the projects. I'm not concerned with going out of the fund balance a little bit each year. These numbers are relatively low. And I just think moving forward, my concern about refinancing isn't too big because I think the federally, our interest rates, we're paying $1 trillion of interest by borrowing interest. So the way they're keeping inflation down right now is to raise interest rates. And I don't see that genie ever going back in the bottle. So I don't think we're going to have much opportunity to, redo our interest rates at a lower rate in the next 10 years. That's just my opinion. So that's where I'm at.
Any thoughts?
Mandy, you have any thoughts? Do we have you completely baffled?
No, I appreciate the information from all of you. As you saw, my pen was moving very quickly across the page. I too am for the same low-cost option B. However, as you can all see, we're missing the majority of the board. And I think that we should give them ample time to take this all in, ask questions, deep dive. Obviously you probably won't be joining us again next week or in 2 weeks, but I know that Jeff can answer those, field those. If not,
If not,
he
I can
can-
ask them.
Correct. So I don't want to rush to put something on the agenda until we give the other board members ample time as well.
We can put it on as a discussion item, because no action will be necessary. And then because these gentlemen have presented a November borrowing, I would imagine we're still within ample time that if they took action later in September, that would be fine. Yeah. So we'll just put on as a discussion because it'll just promote further.
And I'll
like
talk
Mrs.
to,
Jink said.
I'll talk to Steve Hobbs to make sure if we have to advertise it for discussion or if we have to advertise it for action. And I guess then what we could do is have action at the first meeting in September, that, whatever that date is.
I think it's the 13th.
All right, I'll go with that, 13th of September. Because that would give us time. All right. All right, I have nothing else for that. Unless there's any other questions.
All right.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you coming.
Going back
Thank
to
you.
Riders? You going back
Okay.
to Riders? You gonna take them back to Riders?
Good discipline.
There you go.
I appreciate the clarity, guys. You were very, very good at elucidating.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Agenda item 6B, change orders, I guess. Is it gonna turn it over to Nate?
So in the past project, the board took action and authorized me, the facilities director, to be able to approve change orders kind of on the fly as issues arose. As this project's getting underway, I wanted to introduce that idea again and see if the board is interested in pursuing that again. I personally think it makes a lot of sense because as you're in the midst of a construction, particularly a renovation project like this, there are times when, for instance, we're removing the roof membrane, we encounter additional bad insulation that we didn't anticipate. We thought we had it all identified, and maybe we missed a spot. It obviously needs to be cut out and replaced. As far as I'm concerned, that's a no-brainer. But if I don't have that authorization to tell the roofers to proceed and say, oh, you have to hold up until I get board action to authorize your change order, basically runs the roofers off the roof, holding up the process, driving up costs, causing all kinds of scheduling dynamics that I think is probably not the best for the district. There's many aspects in that, similar to that you run into in a renovation project. The middle school project, well, what we did, I think I was authorized up to $10,000 per change order. What I typically did is if we ran across something that I thought was just definitely need to be addressed one way or the other, I would give the chair of the Building and Grounds Committee a phone call, a text, an email. Hey, we ran into this. This is what it's looking like. I really think we need to move forward. So it gave a little bit of board oversight as to what was happening. And then we come back around and as a board take action on the change order retroactively. I think it worked well. I think it kept us moving forward, kept us on a schedule. I'm obviously not inclined to just make a flying whim judgment call on something just because I think it looks good. It's going to be, in my mind, constrained to things that just are structurally, functionally necessary to have a good, sound building for the school district. If this project was $10,000, I'm not sure what the board's comfort level would be as far as authorizing to move forward in that type of nature. But as we've seen, the construction costs have all jumped up quite a bit since this project. I don't know if the board would be interested in $20,000. It's really up to the board. But I think it does make sense for a project of this nature.
Anybody have any questions or comments?
I'd like us to identify a dollar amount for change orders.
I'll throw a,
This isn't like a dollar amount. This is just to keep the work, like if something comes up before a meeting, like if we have meetings roughly
I
every 2
understand that,
weeks.
but it's like a maximum is what I mean.
No,
but, yeah, I understand what you're saying, a maximum that he's allowed to go for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw out a $15,000 figure that anything below $15,000, he has the authorization to go ahead and tell the contractors, in his opinion, yeah, it's okay to go ahead and do this change order and then bring that back to the board at the next meeting. Anything, as he said, anything that would go over that 15,000, he contacts the chairman of the building and grounds, or he contacts myself, and runs it by us so that we're at least aware. And then at that point, we can also notify the rest of the board members via emails and say, hey, we came across da, 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 da. And we need, in order to keep the project on schedule, we need to give authorization to go ahead. So I'm looking at a 15,000 figure for this project.
So with that in mind, where do you put the lowest that amount of pre-authorization that still doesn't hamstring you for change orders? I mean, I know that
It's really up to the board, whatever your comfort level is.
okay.
I think to a certain degree, I encourage you to trust my judgment as far as what I think is imperative that has to happen on a daily basis. But I understand it's the board's purse strings to oversee. And so whatever the board's comfortable with is fine. We'll work within that. Obviously, if it gets too high, I mean, I'm absolutely calling the board and letting them know, hey, we ran into, a major issue here. We need to get together and talk about it. Whether it's 10, 15, it's whatever the board's comfortable with.
I mean, I'm speaking from a position I think we've overspent already. So, but at the same time, I understand if we're going to proceed forward and I'm outvoted, I don't want to hamstring a project. But my opinion is we've overspent. So that's where I have to balance, and that's why I want at least set an amount that comes before the board, so we at least have that discussion here. So.
Well,
I get-
anything, this is for sort of unforeseen or
Yeah.
things that are like, things that would have been discovered during demo or like, you know what I mean? Like this, if we're going to make a major change or if they say they're gonna do something, that stuff would be priced and brought before it even would get ordered. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, like say they were gonna make a different door option because of the color or well, they're not gonna order all them like need to in 2 weeks. You know what I mean? In other words, they're gonna present that, and if it's $100,000, because that's what we want for, you know what I mean, then so be it. But this is more or less for, I guess, like, if there's a wall
No, I understand
that
the
we
nature
knock
of it.
down, that we
Yeah.
need to put steel up to make sure the roof doesn't collapse, and that costs $10,000. You know what I mean? It's kind of not, I don't want to say anyone's fault. It wasn't known because it was hidden.
No, and I understand that. I mean, we have to be able to make quick expenditures for minor issues that are discovered. I get that. So I don't know. If we're going to an amount, I like 10 better than 15. But
It doesn't matter to me. I mean, I just throw something out there because
Yeah, no, I
it gets discussion started. And if it comes down to it and we go with 10,000, that's fine. The only thing to think about is that if he comes across something in 2 or 3 weeks from now, there might be an emergency board meeting called.
I'm
And that
willing
could
to
happen 2 or 3 more times
Right.
in the next month.
come as often as you need me.
So, I mean, whatever figure the board feels comfortable with.
Well, and again, all of them get approved by the board anyway.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They all come back ultimately to get board approved. I would suggest that the majority of the change orders you see are very minor. When I say minor, $2,000, $3,000. They don't
Okay.
get to that level. When they get big, they come before the board first anyway, and we push those off and make those decisions later. It's a common process that we've done for all of our projects since I've been here.
Yeah, I was just trying to
Um,
get a sense because
yeah.
I'm new to this. Of
Yeah,
what is a
well,
change order? How
yeah.
big are they?
And
that
I'd
sort of
also
thing.
say that the majority of those smaller change orders are what we'd all sit around the table and say are no-brainers. They just make common sense and you do them. And some of them are even in our benefit. They're change orders that are deduct change orders. So, if they see a way of doing something that's going to cost them less money, they'll come to Nate and say, "Are you willing to save $2,000?" Well, sure, we're going to save $2,000. As long as it makes sense, and we're able to do it. But yeah, as it's whatever the number the board wishes to pick. And again, it's not that, he's not going to tell the board anything under that number. He's going to share with the board those things too. It's just a matter of trying to keep those small things moving.
Yeah, and the only reason I threw out, a bigger number than the previous project, because we've just all seen construction expenses expand that much. But, whatever the board's comfortable with, it's fine. We work within it.
So in this case, because we have four prime contracts on the job. So, if one of these instances that comes up, it could affect multiple. So we're saying 10,000 for all four, not per contract.
Well, I would interpret it as 10,000 per contract. So
Yeah.
even if it goes across all four primes, if they're all $2,000 each, to me, that's only $8,000 and it's only $2,000 for each.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't see that as hitting that threshold. Even if there are four of them at $3,000 each, I would see them as three or four individual
Okay.
change orders
Yeah,
for
I'm
$3,000.
okay with that. I guess I just wanted to make sure that
Sure.
we're all thinking the same thing, that's all. You know what I mean? In other
Yeah.
words,
No, I get you.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I guess if we weren't gonna think that way, I feel like we need to up it. Because I think, I don't think that would go.
Well, yeah, each thing that would come before come within this project, if it involves more than one prime, then each one's gonna have its own change order,
Correct. Right.
okay? And so each change order per prime could be $10,000. And it's whatever it is the issue, it may go across two or three of the primes. Each one of those has a $10,000 threshold,
Okay.
right?
Mhm.
So, and in light of the fact that because it could impact three or all four of the primes, we don't want to hold a decision up because of that fact. It's going to impact four primes and taking them off the job until we get a board meeting together.
Right.
I'm of the opinion up to 10,000 across all contracts, and then we have a discussion. We discussed the scoreboard, which is 25,000, across several meetings, and that was 25,000. We're about half that at 10. So I just think I prefer to have a discussion. I'm always available. That's my.
Well, I guess we're gonna put this on the agenda for discussion and then come up,
Right.
I mean, it's gonna get voted on. I mean, we're not making
Right, it has.
a decision, we're just kind of generally
Yeah.
bringing it up.
So do not put it on the next board meeting for a motion yet? You want to discuss it further?
I think it could be put on the agenda with the goal of discussing it and coming to a resolution on the amount, yes.
Well, let me ask, have you been approached with any change orders so far?
Oh, no, no.
I know we're early in the project and we're just putting up the fence, but there could be a change order.
No, I'm thinking where it impacts the district, where the flexibility and the speed of decision, example like the roof. You have roofers that are working, they're planning on replacing insulation. It's just it turns it a little bit more than what we planned.
Right.
We're cutting a hole in this concrete floor and pouring a concrete pier to hold a new steel column. We dig down there and we found unsuitable dirt at 18 inches like we planned on. And I stand there and say, well, we're going to need to dig this down to 4 foot. Most of the time you don't think any of those are going to be huge expenses, but it's just been, construction world's been a little bit challenging managing expenses sometimes. But, if we're standing there digging with the equipment, doing the hole, and everybody's standing there waiting on that to get done, it doesn't necessarily behoove us to delay that process and hold people up and mess up the schedule.
If we discuss at the 23rd board meeting and take action at the September 13th meeting, would that pose any problems, or do you foresee that being in a timely enough fashion?
Well, you never know when something's going to pop up. I mean, it's my hope that, we'll talk about schedule here a little bit, but, within 2 weeks, I hope to be breaking ground on footers and stuff. So, if you dig and you hit a rock and somebody's saying, hey, we need a bigger piece of equipment to get that rock out of the way to keep moving, that's the kind of dynamic that, we could be faced with.
So if that's the case, then we probably should put it on the agenda for action. You just have to tell what number, and if you want to adjust the numbers, you can make that adjustment at the meeting, but
Yeah, I mean,
well-
we've done this already before.
Right.
And we have an amount. So, I mean, other than coming up with the amount that we're going to go forward with this, which could be decided at that meeting.
Are you comfortable with 10, I guess? Is that,
It's a good point. Like Rich said, we can still put it on agenda and discuss
let's,
prior.
yeah,
I
let's
mean,
put
I'm-
on, let's put it on for
Yeah.
10.
Put it on for
See where it
10.
goes and
Yep.
yeah, have
We're,
more
we're
discussion.
all okay with 10, just exactly how it gets applied right now is.
well, I guess
probably-
I was going to suggest that if the board consensus is 10, like the last project, we can always absolutely start there. And if we get into the process and we find out, hey, maybe we're hamstrung here a little bit, we need a little bit more flexibility, I'd propose we come back and readdress a little bit if the contractors can justify where they're coming from and why we're seeing bigger numbers than what we might have seen before.
Yeah, and that works. And I will just say that in the past, number of construction projects that I've been involved with Nate, if something comes down the pike that needs attention, to keep the project going, he will reach out to whoever the building and grounds chair is, because it's been done. I've been in the building and grounds before and been called to, and he calls me, as board president and runs it by me just to get another opinion before anything happens. So, I'm comfortable to start with at the 10,000.
All right.
Yeah, it'll give us something to start with and we can reassess if we need to.
All right, schedule.
Well, just the one other quick comment about change orders is the value engineering process. I shared with the board, we're going to process those through change orders. We have met in person with Lobar to kind of hone in on some of those value engineering ideas. We're still setting up meetings with the other prime contractors to have those kind of specific conversations. I wanted to let the board know what to anticipate as we went through, identified some of the things that were easy to define, things that were less discussion, say, lump those together. We'll bring those to the board as our first round of change orders. These next item that we identify is probably another 10 items. These take more discussion, more scope definition, more back and forth. That'll be the second round, and then there's possibly a third round of change orders, depending on how the conversations go, that architecture actually having to do some redesign, some drawings, a lot more specification work to be able to identify what we're doing with the value engineering. So I just want to let the board know that's what to expect. We throw a lot of numbers around of what we're hoping to narrow the budget gap by. And it will be coming through in chunks is what the plan is at this point. Okay. So schedule-wise, this survey, the construction survey crew's been out, the exterior structures have been staked. The fence company's been called. They should be out this week to do our temporary fencing. They've also set up for the erosion sediment control contractor to come out and put the silt sock around the project. All that needs to be done basically prior to being able to break ground, which we're hoping until the end of the week they would have that ability to do that. Once the erosion sediment control, I think there's like a 3-day notification process that York County Conservation District has to come out and approve your stormwater management structures before you actually break ground. So we'll get that action done. I think it'll be a day or two lapse in there before we actually start seeing the sod getting rolled back. But the plan is, from there, the rear new parking area should get boxed out and stoned in, so we have additional parking for staff. The job trailer area and site laydown areas for the construction materials will get stripped out and stoned to control the mud. And the contractors plan on breaking ground on the music suite additions first. They are currently working inside, removing the ACT acoustical tile ceilings so that they can get a better assessment what's up above there and be able to start making plans to run the utilities from the mechanical areas down to these new additions. So we're trying to target those areas, not tear out a lot more ceiling than what we need, but there's ceiling we're gonna have to disturb so they get up there and start making plans, because once you open it up, it's a lot of measurements, scanning that goes on to make sure you get the ductwork, the electrical conduits, the plumbing pipes. A lot of stuff goes up there. It seems like it's a big space, but it really fills up quick.
All right.
Good.
All right. Number 7 is other.
So I have a number of others I just wanted to give the board an FYI on. Scoreboard base construction is planned to start middle of this week. We've had a lot of support from those community members that Kevin Dickmeyer's pulled together. Just want to give them a shout. Jeremiah Ross, Keith Smith Concrete is providing the labor to tie the rebar. Eastern Caisson is donating drilling the holes for the piers. KLK Welding is providing the structural steel. So through this group, and I think a couple other members that I haven't identified, they're really pulling the base together for a good economical number. We have a schedule, we have a plan, and hopefully till early next week, we should have the concrete piers in. We'll let it sit for about a week to let the concrete cure, so we're not putting 20-foot steel columns up and torquing on anchor bolts in green concrete. Let it get at least that 7-day strength. And all goes well, we should have the brand new scoreboard up in time for the first game. Visitor bleacher update, as you can see, there's not much been happening down there yet. We talked about the bleachers are not in yet. They've been ordered for months and months. The conversation has been, I've talked to Troy numerous times, that the visitor team for the scrimmage this upcoming weekend, we're encouraging just to sit in the home side. It's just a scrimmage. If not, they can bring chairs. I think there's still time for the first varsity game, which I think is September 1st. Should be about a 2-week process once they get the stuff here. But if that would not come to fruition, the fallback plan there would be, we have a number of portable bleachers on our other athletic fields that, while we don't necessarily want to be dragging bleacher sections around, we do have that capability that we can move a number of bleacher sections down from some of the grass athletic fields to be able to host our visiting team. Park Hills Playground project is complete and in and being used. We do have the new Halo vape sensors in. We're getting ready to install those so we can demo those detectors in our restrooms. Provided we get good results out of those, I'll be coming back to the board with a plan to expand the use of those across the middle school and future plans for the high school.
We test those? That's what that is.
Yeah, we bring a couple in and try them out. The first batch we tried out, we didn't get the sensitivity and the results we were hoping to get. So this brand of sensor, I've reached out to a number of other school districts that have had good results. Their biggest complaint is false positives. We were having problems with no notifications, which wasn't doing as much for the money we were spending. So at the end of the day, as long as the false positives aren't crazy, it's a better position. Press box has been painted at the stadium. I think Wes Winter is working with that alumni group to try to get the mural that faces toward the high school repainted. So other than that, I think Brenneman Paintings did a nice job on the press box. We've also have railings ordered to be replaced on the stairs to enter the press box, as the current railings don't meet modern code anymore. So those are in process. So we're working our way to getting that stadium brought up to modern code. And then just quick word on the parking permits. Because of the construction requirements, I'm anticipating we're going to need at least 50 parking spaces for contractors, not to mention truck deliveries and big material deliveries. We're going to be condensing the student population's parking area. With an assigned parking space like we had for the last 4 to 5 years, we end up with a lot of vacant spaces because they're personally assigned. With a color-coded, if you have a student parking permit and you can park in this lot, it allows us to get better efficiency out of that. That's how we're planning on squeezing the extra contractors parking out of it. It's really no different than how this district operated for probably a decade prior to us implementing an assigned parking space. We're also going to do but color coordinated permitted parking for our staff on the main campus too, in order to try to control our parking and make sure we know who's parking where. But I just kind of wanted to address that real quick with the board after some of the conversation. But, it's something we thought about. The other option I felt was if we didn't go to a color coordinated parking lot permit and stuck with an assigned parking space, we'd end up having to tell 50 students that they're no longer able to buy a parking space in the parking lot. I think through this approach, we shouldn't hit that max near as quick. So then I guess the other quick update, Manheim last week with that storm got slammed pretty hard. The elementary schools are without power for 2 days, I believe. There's a couple areas in the township that were out probably 3 days. The school went through it fine. We had temporary power. Things still happened within the building. We did extend out to the local community the ability to get water from that Manheim Elementary School because everybody in Manheim Township is on a well pump with no electricity. Everybody's without water. So I think that was a good thing. We had a number of community residents coming and using our water off the side of the building, which I think was a good community service for the township. But all in all, things are back together and working down there again. And then the final two things I would have would be the comment at our previous meeting about the sidewalk and the community gardens. So the sidewalk as proposed from the high school down Southwest Drive down to Breezewood would be in the neighborhood of 1,200 lineal feet of sidewalk. It's tough geography. It would be an expensive build if the district proposed to pursue that. Some of my concerns are ADA requirements on sidewalks. I think there's some areas we would probably be pushing acceptable slope on the sidewalk. There's minimum slope left and right, and there's also maximum slope as far as up and down. I think we would have some challenges with. We would have a stream crossing. We would have a crosswalk that would have to get approved. And there's a lot of grade, a lot of trees. It's an environmental center. I'm sure it would end up by township zoning enforcement that we'd have to get all this surveyed and engineered and professionally designed, which would end up invoking ENS and tacking on to our MPDS permit with the high school project. Just quick numbers on the sidewalk without the permitting, the engineering, the design, just trying to do a search and see where lineal foot sidewalk numbers are. We're probably in the $40,000 to $50,000 range just for concrete sidewalk. That doesn't address, as I said, the design aspects. Some of the areas are going to require major grading, and it definitely doesn't address how we get across the creek. I think the other thing I would throw out would be that if we do it there, I question would we want to do it on the back side of the middle school down to Bear Avenue. In the mornings, the reality that I see is we have more middle schoolers that would ride bikes or walk to the middle school than what we see the higher level kids. Higher level kids seem like they have more options as far as friends picking them up, willing to ride the bus, drive themselves, whatever it may be. But I see actual more foot traffic, more pedestrian type traffic coming from the backside of this building from Bear Avenue. That unfortunately is 1,800 lineal feet of sidewalk if we chose to pursue that. And again, down where our sidewalk would have the ability to tie into existing town sidewalk, there's an extreme amount of grade and trees that happen down behind the old softball field that tie in at the edge of the property, which I'm not quite sure how would we effectively traverse that and meet the ADA codes and stuff again. Logically, in the old days, we could have put a flight of stairs and a rail on it, would have been fine. Today's standards, I don't think there's any way that would be deemed acceptable from the township's eyes. In a nutshell, I think between the two, if we aggregated them together, you're probably looking at over $100,000 in sidewalk construction fees, not to mention the zoning applications, the erosion sediment controls, the major grading removal of trees. I think we're looking at a project that goes, up to $150,000 to $200,000, depending on what all gets invoked, if the board wanted to pursue that direction. Yeah, Jeff had pointed out to me that the township had approached the district 10, 15 years ago about adding some of this sidewalk at that point. They had no interest from the township's end of helping monetarily. They just thought it'd be a nice idea if we did it. But of course, as we all know, there'd be a lot of regulations and constraints that would come along with that. And then the other aspect to think about is the maintenance and long-term usability of this. We're going to effectively at least double, if not triple, the amount of sidewalk that we would have to maintain and take care of, particularly in the wintertime. So you have a snow day, and now we've potentially added 3,000 feet of sidewalk that we have to shovel, salt, clear off, maintain. So it ends up being a lot.
In this discussion, I guess what drives it is how many kids are in the road, right? Have we looked at those numbers in the past to see how many kids are walking down that road? Or do we have someone out there that, when school starts, that can kind of do a mental tick every morning to see how many kids are in our roads, to see whether it even precipitates us doing this?
I don't know that we have somebody already in that position, but I think it's something that we could try to target somebody to put an eye on it a couple mornings and get it.
See whether it drives it, whether this man drives it.
We're checking that out as far as, what kind of usage are we having by the students in that area?
Yeah, it just seems, I've noticed in the past, the Bear Avenue direction, the students will come up Bear Avenue to the corner of our property and then cut diagonally across the old ball fields and across the backside of the fields. They usually don't follow the road. I suspect that the average middle schooler, even if we put a sidewalk along the road, would probably still cut,
Yep.
as the crow flies. And I don't think any of us here would really probably embrace the idea of running a concrete sidewalk diagonally straight through the middle of our athletic field. So I'm not sure we would be able to avoid that footpath direction.
That side, not as much, but I mean, high school
The-
going down
the
that
high
hill,
school,
that's the
correct.
one we
That-
really should look at.
Correct. So, yeah, we can.
That's the one that probably has That's the one that may have as many, if not more, difficulties because you're going over wetlands
Mhm.
and the amount going down to keep it ADA, you're gonna have to do a lot of zigzags back and forth all the way down, so that'll increase the lineal square footage that we're talking about. There's some significant hurdles there.
At the end of the day, there's a reason those sidewalks have never been put in
Right.
before. So, and then the other idea of a community garden, at the end of the day, I'd shared with the resident that, the first thing the agreement would have to be, it is a school district. We severely limit and control what type of pesticides or anything of that nature we'd be able to use on district property. It would have to basically be an organic type garden. And I think from the daily aspect of it, my question would be, how do we manage, what are we acceptable with as far as community members coming upon our campus and accessing campus grounds in the midst of a school day? Who's responsible for the garden? Who's going to resolve the complaints when Joe stepped on Jane's vines and ruined a cantaloupe or, whatever. I don't know. But I think that would probably be our biggest concern as a district viewpoint. Not that it can't be done, but there'd be
Well, yeah.
some things that would definitely have to be thought about and somebody assigned to.
My first question, that comment was, do we have a horticulture and FFA? We don't have anything to that.
We're looking at it. We're looking at adding it in the future. But I will say that Mr. Osborne brings up a good point, and any safety audit will tell you, don't put things on your grounds that should bring traffic during the day that shouldn't normally be there. That's why you won't see a community a bin on our property, because it just, I get the idea, and I'm certainly, obviously from a natural perspective and a teaching perspective, I think it would be nice to have for our students. But as far as the community bringing people in during the day onto our property when students are here, not suggesting they're going to do anything nefarious, but any safety audit will tell you, don't do things to bring people on your campus that shouldn't normally be there when the kids are here. So that's just
Right, and
from a
that's,
safety perspective.
that's exactly what I'm getting. So until we have a horticulture or an FFA or a club that wants to develop a community garden that would drive it internally, right? That would be the only way I'd see that coming to
We
something.
have community gardens already at Manheim, as was mentioned at the
Right.
last meeting. The challenge you run into is, who's taking care of it over the summer months. And we've had situations where we've received complaints from citizens from weeds growing all over the garden and looking unsightly. And I know there was one summer that the support services team, we went down for a day to weed the garden in the middle of the summer. We do those small gardens, we do take whatever produce is grown, they do use it in the cafeteria. I know Crystal implements whatever tomatoes we get, puts them in the spaghetti sauce and stuff. So the kids are actually eating the produce that they're producing, it's a really good learning exercise. The challenge is size. You really can't we don't have a real big one. Fence, deer, eating the crops. There's some challenges there that make it a little bit trickier too.
But that Manheim garden, though, that's not really open to the community. I mean, maybe it's mentioned that way, but it's only the school students that are using it.
Yeah, I don't know where you'd actually put a community garden and how that would work, because now you're talking about other liability issues. I mean, what happens if someone gets hurt on our property at a community garden? I mean, yeah, there's some things you have to think through when it gets to that situation.
It's a nice idea, but.
Is that it?
That's all I got.
All right. Visitors.
Well, I did have one question on other. So I had someone mention to me recently, scale pay, and I'd never heard of it before. Basically, the concept is you get paid 2 to 3 times more working on a job for governmental agencies than you do out in the private sector. Do we engage in that? Is that baked into our square footage rate?
Their
And-
choice.
We have to. That's a requirement of the school code and also requirement of the federal law. So yes, we
That's
pay
what I wanted to
prevailing
ask him.
wage. It's crazy. It's one of those things we've tried to advocate for years at the state level to change it. But no dice. I mean, when we did the West Manheim project, we had contractors that were just moving dirt, earthwork movers, just with the bulldozers. They would get paid $45 an hour working our job. They go down to Walmart and they get paid $26 an hour.
Right.
Same exact stuff, doing the exact same thing, less than a half a mile away.
That just came on my, that's why I wanted to ask, can I get the code or can you refer me to just where that starts or?
Sure.
Okay.
It's called prevailing wage. I got
Yeah,
a folder
prevailing
this
wage.
big, and it's based off of Davis-Bacon, which is a 1933 Depression era law that is
Okay.
interesting. We'll leave it at that.
I didn't want to trip up I'd never heard of it. and I wanted
That's
to
part
understand.
of the reason why the cost of the project
Yeah.
goes up and continues going up,
Con-
because the prevailing wage for what they pay in areas like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the wage is much higher than it is around here as normal.
Mhm.
But then when you get into projects like this and the public buildings, you must follow the federal law as prevailing wage. You don't have a choice.
15 years ago, we bid out a roof project. It was just roof repairs for a couple of our buildings. And we forgot to put in prevailing wage. The bid came in at $84,000. We said, sorry, we can't do that. We went out and did the exact same scope of work, with the exact same contractors. The bid came in at $126,000.
Mm.
Almost $50,000 more for the exact same scope of work. That's prevailing wage.
Yeah, that's why I want to understand it and possibly,
There is no understanding.
right?
It's just vehemently wrong.
Yeah.
So, and then just to draw a little bit of a distinction, on our standard state school project was traditionally had Plan Con state funding, and yet they had that leverage. It was Pennsylvania state prevailing wages. This project, because of some of the ESSER's relief funds, we're using federal monies. So that is back to a Davis-Bacon, which was the federal level ruling. It parallels one another. The Pennsylvania state prevailing wage parallels the Davis-Bacon. You don't see a whole lot of difference in it. But on this particular project for the high school, we'll be following federal Davis-Bacon wage determinations versus the middle school was Pennsylvania state prevailing wage
And the
determination.
federal's higher or either even?
It's pretty much a wash. You'll
Okay.
find a little bit of difference between one of the other one's charts, but at the end of the day, we don't feel there's much of an overall impact.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay. Visitors, does anybody have any comments or? All right.
Before we close, I have one thing that we've been talking about the last couple meetings, and that is in addition to our website with regards to the project. I'm happy to say that Nate has informed me that that site that is available. You go to our home page, go to the About tab, and under Services, you'll find Facilities. And if you take the Facilities link, it takes you to that page, and there is a Southwestern High School renovation project tab right there. And that gives you all the background information so far since the beginning of the project, which was October of 2021. Everything is listed there, all kinds of presentations that was made by Crabtree Rohrball, and notations as far as building and grounds meetings, any information that may not be there. And I didn't have a chance to look at it because Nate just informed me tonight. But the official minutes of the building and grounds meetings, going back to October 21 and coming forward, each month has everything detailed with regards to the project. From the very first statement of a budget to all the options that were presented, the decision of the board to go with a specific option, and things from that on, all the way up through to where we are today. So everything is there, it's documented under building and grounds minutes. So, and it's available. Everything's out there that we need to support the project. Any information you need to know is there. And if it's not there, I suggest that you go to our school board link, go to meetings, and under minutes, you'll find all the minutes to all the meetings, board meetings, committee meetings. But for this project, it would be under, of course, building and grounds minutes. So it's all there backing up everything from the start. And that's all I have.
All right. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Meeting adjourned.